Here we go.
Outrageous!
Hello, my name is John, and I love action movies as well as anime and comic book media. So if you're like me, maybe click that subscribe button. I'll have stuff out in the future, hopefully. And today, we are continuing my James Bond journey, where I watched through all of the main Eon Bond films, most for the first time. And today we are moving on to 1967's You Only Live Twice, directed by Lewis Gilbert, starring Sean Connery as James Bond. And let's get started by talking about the action. This film has some pretty great action sequences. One of the standouts for me was definitely the helicopter chase, as well as the final ninja raid on the Volcano Spectre base. And I thought the action was pretty creative in this film. I was a big fan of the cigarette rockets. But one thing about the creativity, I guess, they relied a little too heavily on green screen effects in some of the action sequences, which kind of holds it back a little bit because of how noticeable it was. But another positive about the action is the hand-to-hand and melee fighting. It's probably the best one at least out of these first few films. And as a fan of sword fighting and sword play, I loved the little couple moments we got of that, whether it was the training sequence or even in that last battle there was kind of a fight scene with a swordsman. I appreciated those nice little touches with that. And so I guess there's not much else to say about the action, so let's move on to the acting and the characters. Sean Connery is great as James Bond, as he usually is. And then the villains. Mr. Osato is pretty forgettable. And then I think Helga Brandt, she was very interesting when she was on screen, and she was acted pretty well, but she wasn't utilized very well. And I think, much like Thunderball, they had this great female villain that was a kind of a great counter to James Bond's ladies' man mentality, but then they wasted them. I think if Osato was the one to get killed about halfway through rather than Helga, then I think it would have heightened the movie a little bit more. But the main villain to talk about in this film is Blofeld. And Donald Pleasence does a great job playing him. You know, Halloween, this is a decade before Halloween, but I'm a big fan of the original Halloween. The franchise as a whole, not so much, but the first original Halloween I'm a big fan of. So it was great seeing Sam Loomis as Blofeld. But last thing about the acting, this movie takes place in Japan, and there's a lot of Japanese actors, and I'm pretty sure if these actors were speaking Japanese, they'd be phenomenal. But the thing is, they don't seem entirely fluent in English, and mainly with the Bond girls, when they're interacting with James Bond, they're speaking English and they just don't seem entirely fluent in it, and so I think it holds back their acting a little bit. But I think someone like Tetsuro Tamba did a decent job. I know he's been in a couple samurai films as well. He did a decent job with it, but the main thing is some of the Bond girls, it didn't feel like they were entirely there in terms of the language stuff. And I guess moving on to the visuals. The production design is great as usual, as they are in all of these James Bond films. Then the cinematography is good. It's not the greatest out of these first few films, but it's still pretty good. It's serviceable. And when they're in space, in the space shuttle sequences, I think those actually hold up really well. But like I mentioned before, a lot of the stuff is reliant on green screen effects, and I don't think those type of effects hold up entirely well. Even for its time period, I don't think it holds up as well as other action movies from the time period. And so I'm not someone that likes to take points away for aging, but it doesn't age as well as films from the similar 60s era. And the next part is both kind of visuals and a little bit with the story. And it's very nitpicky because it's only a small portion of the film. But they try to disguise James Bond as a Japanese man at one point in the film. He did not look Japanese at all. He just looked like Sean Connery with a different hairstyle. But then, so that's kind of the visual aspect. So let's move on to the story, and we'll stay on the same topic. Once he is disguised as this Japanese man, they just put a giant hat on him that covers his face anyway. So what was the actual point of doing that if you're just going to cover his face up? That kind of didn't entirely sit well with me, but it's very nitpicky because it's a small portion of the film. But overall, it's a great story. I liked the idea of, I liked Spectre's plan of the threat of a war between the US and Soviets by Spectre hijacking their space shuttles, but the US thinking it was the Soviets that hijacked it, and the Soviets thinking it was the US. I thought there's a nice kind of story and plot to give Spectre, and nice threat of war type of scenario. And I loved how the opening of the film, they kind of fake Bond's death. You know he's not dead, so it's not much of a spoiler. Although I've already had spoilers in this review. These James Bond reviews are going to be spoil-filled. But I did like that sequence. I mean, obviously it goes with the name, You Only Live Twice, you know. And then the pacing is pretty good throughout this film, although about halfway through, after the helicopter action scene, I understand when you have an action scene like that, you need to kind of slow down the pace a little bit, you know, kind of try and catch your breath. But I think they went a little too much on the slowing down the pace. But the pace, once you get introduced to the ninja facility thing, pace picks right back up and has you till the end of the film. And so overall, I think the pacing is pretty good in this movie. And moving on to the sound, the score felt a little generic. It felt like a generic James Bond score, which isn't bad. The James Bond theme is good. But like, if you hear this movie score, you're just going to know it's a James Bond movie. You're not necessarily going to be able to depict which Bond movie it is. Whereas you hear the Goldfinger score, you know that's a Goldfinger. Where this one, it just kind of feels James Bond, but it doesn't necessarily entirely come out as, oh, that's the You Only Live Twice score. It just comes off as a James Bond score. But it doesn't get in the way of the film. It's not really a negative entirely. But a good aspect about the sound would be the incorporation of countdowns in that final action sequence when the ninjas are raiding the Spectre base. You know, they have like the countdowns. The scenes that you see on screen might not be within the room or on the people giving the countdown, but they still have it within like the sound mix. And I just think having countdowns like that add a lot to a sense of urgency to the action sequence. So those are always a nice touch. And now on to the overall rating of the film. It's a very well-written spy thriller with some great action sequences, some great production design, but it does rely a little too heavily on green screen effects, and a little too much on actors speaking outside of their native language. And so for these reasons, I think a 3.5 is a fair score to give You Only Live Twice. Thanks for watching my video. If you've seen You Only Live Twice, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you like this video, if you like me, smash that thumbs up button and consider clicking that subscribe button if you want to continue along my James Bond journey, and even if you enjoy movies, comics, and anime as I do. And as always, have a great day.